Robert Chen had everything most people dreamed of. A mansion in the hills, cars that cost more than houses, a tech company worth billions. But on that Thursday afternoon in September, none of it seemed to matter much. He sat in first class, flying back from Singapore 3 days earlier than planned. A tropical storm had grounded half the flights in Asia, and his important meeting had been canceled. Robert hated wasted time. Every minute was supposed to mean something, to build towards something bigger. That's how he'd gotten where he was. The car service picked him up from the airport at 2 in the afternoon. As they drove through the gates of his estate, Robert felt that familiar emptiness he'd been trying to ignore for months. The house was beautiful. Then bedrooms, an Olympic pool, gardens that required a full-time staff. But it had stopped feeling like a home about 2 years ago when his wife packed her bags and left. She'd taken almost nothing with her except her clothes and jewelry. Didn't want the house. Didn't fight for custody. She just wanted out, and she'd made that painfully clear. Their son was 8 years old then, and Robert remembered the confusion in the boy's eyes when his mother kissed him goodbye and promised to visit soon. Those visits had become less and less frequent. Now they barely happened at all. Robert pulled his suitcase from the trunk and walked toward the side entrance. He expected the house to be quiet. His son, Danny, should have been at his tutoring session until 5. The housekeeper, Mrs. Okonkwo, would probably be upstairs changing sheets or doing whatever it was she did during the day. He paid her well, and she kept the house spotless. That was the extent of what he knew about her, and he'd never really thought to learn more. But as he opened the door, he heard something unexpected. Laughter. Real, genuine laughter. The kind that comes from deep in your belly when something actually delights you. Robert set his suitcase down quietly and followed the sound. It was coming from the library, a room he rarely used except for the occasional video call when he wanted to look more sophisticated. The door was halfway open, and what he saw made him freeze completely. The entire floor was covered with papers, books, and what looked like homemade games. Colorful drawings were spread across the Persian rug his ex-wife had paid $30,000 for. And right in the middle of it all sat Mrs. Okonkwo and Danny, both cross-legged like they were at a picnic. Danny was reading out loud from a book, his voice excited and animated. Mrs. Okonkwo listened with complete attention, nodding and smiling. Every few sentences she'd gently correct his pronunciation or ask him a question about what he'd just read. But it wasn't the stern, impatient correction Robert had heard from the expensive tutors. It was warm, encouraging. What really struck Robert were the materials around them. Hand-drawn maps, a board game made from cardboard with little paper pieces, flashcards with pictures and words, charts showing planets and dinosaurs and historical timelines. Everything looked homemade, created with care. Mrs. Okonkwo was in the middle of telling a story now, and Danny was completely absorbed. She was talking about a young boy in Nigeria who wanted to read but had no books, so he borrowed one book from a traveling merchant and read it so many times he memorized every word. Then he'd tell the stories to other children in his village, changing them slightly each time, making them his own. Danny's eyes were wide. "Did he become a writer?" he asked. "Better," Mrs. Okonkwo said with a gentle smile. "He became a teacher, because he learned that stories are how we pass on everything important. History, science, math, all of it can be a story if you know how to look at it right." Robert felt something twist in his chest. When was the last time he'd sat on the floor with his son? When was the last time Danny had looked at him with that kind of enthusiasm? He tried to remember and came up empty. Danny suddenly noticed him standing in the doorway. The joy drained from his face instantly, replaced by something that looked like fear, or maybe guilt. Mrs. Okonkwo turned and saw Robert. She immediately started gathering papers, her movements quick and nervous. "Mr. Chen? I'm so sorry, I didn't hear you come in. We'll clean this up right away. I know you weren't supposed to be back until Saturday, and Robert held up his hand. His throat felt tight. Wait a second." He stepped into the room, looking at everything scattered around them. "What is all this?" Mrs. Okonkwo's hands were shaking slightly as she held a stack of drawings. Danny had gone completely silent, staring at his lap. "I can explain," she said quietly. 3 months ago, Danny was having trouble with his homework. He was crying, saying he was stupid, that he couldn't understand anything. The tutors you hired, they're very qualified, I'm sure, but Danny, he wasn't learning from them. He was just getting more frustrated. Robert knelt down slowly, picking up one of the drawings. It showed the solar system, each planet carefully labeled with facts written in Danny's handwriting. The son had a smiling face. "He made this?" "We made it together," Mrs. Okonkwo said. "I asked your permission to help him with homework, do you remember? You said I could do what I thought was best." Robert vaguely remembered a conversation weeks ago. He'd been on his phone, responding to emails. She'd said something about Danny and schoolwork, and he'd nodded without really listening. "I remember," he said, though he was ashamed of how little attention he'd paid. Mrs. Okonkwo reached for a folder near her knee. Her hands had stopped shaking, but she still looked worried. "I've been keeping track of his progress. I hope that's all right." She handed him the folder. Inside were test papers and report cards spanning 3 months. Robert's eyes widened as he saw the grades climb. Reading had gone from D to B+, math from C- to A-, but there was something else too. Notes from Danny's teacher at school. Comments about improved participation, better focus, more confidence. "How did you—" Robert looked up at Mrs. Okonkwo. Really looked at her for maybe the first time in the year she'd worked for him. "How did you do this?" She hesitated, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. "Before I came to America, I was a teacher in Nigeria for 20 years. I have a master's degree in education. But here, those credentials don't mean much without going through expensive certification programs. So I clean houses. It pays the bills." Robert felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You're a teacher?" "I was a teacher," she corrected gently. "Now I'm a housekeeper who helps your son with his homework. Danny is brilliant, Mr. Chen. He just learns differently than the way most schools teach. He needs stories and games and hands-on activities. He needs to move around and ask questions. The tutors you hired, they just wanted him to sit still and memorize facts. That's not how his brain works." For the first time since Robert had entered the room, Danny spoke. His voice was small but determined. "Mrs. Okonkwo makes learning fun, Dad. She doesn't make me feel dumb. She tells me stories about everything, and then we turn them into games. And his voice cracked slightly. "She listens when I talk. She actually listens." The words hit Robert harder than any business failure ever had. His son was telling him, without directly saying it, that Robert hadn't been listening. That Robert had been so busy building his empire, so consumed with success in deals and growth, that he'd failed at the one job that actually mattered. He looked at the materials spread across the floor. Every single item had been made by hand. Mrs. Okonkwo earned $20 an hour to clean his house, and she'd spent her own time creating an entire curriculum for his son. Not because she had to, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd seen a struggling child and couldn't help but be what she truly was, a teacher. Robert sat down on the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling against the rug. He picked up the homemade board game, examining the careful detail. Little cards with math problems that were actually story scenarios. A path that wound through different countries, teaching geography. Dice made from folded paper. "This must have taken hours," he said quietly. "Danny is worth hours," Mrs. Okonkwo replied simply. Robert looked at his son, who was watching him with cautious hope in his eyes. Then he looked at Mrs. Okonkwo, this woman he'd thought of as just the housekeeper, and realized he'd been blind. Completely, inexcusably blind. "Tell me more," he said, settling himself more comfortably on the floor. "Tell me everything about how you've been teaching him. I want to understand." Danny's face lit up like Christmas morning. Mrs. Okonkwo looked surprised but nodded, a small smile forming. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Robert Chen wasn't thinking about his next meeting or his stock prices or his business strategy. He was exactly where he needed to be, learning about the most important thing he'd been neglecting, his son's life. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he'd seen in the library. The joy on Danny's face, the patience in Mrs. Okonkwo's voice, the careful, loving detail in every homemade learning tool scattered across his expensive rug. Around 2 a.m, he gave up on sleep entirely and went to his office. He pulled up the security camera footage on his computer. He'd installed cameras throughout the house years ago, mostly for security reasons. Now he was using them for something else entirely. He needed to understand what had been happening in his own home, while he was busy conquering the business world. He started with footage from 3 months ago, right around the time Mrs. Okonkwo said she'd begun helping Danny. The first clip almost broke him. Danny was sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down his face, crumpling up a math worksheet. Mrs. Okonkwo walked in with a laundry basket, saw him, and immediately set it down. She didn't rush to fix the problem. She just sat beside him and waited. After a few minutes, Danny whispered, "I'm stupid. I can't do anything right." Mrs. Okonkwo's response was gentle but firm. "You're not stupid, sweetheart. Not even close. Your brain just works differently, and that's actually a gift. Some of the smartest people in history learned differently than everyone else. Now, tell me what's confusing you." Robert watched as she took the worksheet and transformed the problems into a story about a boy collecting rocks. Suddenly, addition and subtraction weren't abstract numbers anymore. They were rocks being found and shared and counted. Danny's tears stopped. He started solving problems. Robert clicked through more footage. There was Mrs. Okonkwo teaching Danny to cook scrambled eggs while explaining fractions through measuring cups. There she was in the garden, letting Danny dig in the dirt while talking about plant biology and ecosystems. Every moment was a lesson, but none of it felt like school. It all felt like life. One clip made Robert pause the video completely. It was from about 6 weeks ago. Danny was sitting on the back porch steps and Mrs. Okonkwo sat beside him. Danny was crying again, but this time it wasn't about homework. "I miss Mom," Danny said, his voice breaking. "Why doesn't she want to see me anymore?" Robert's finger hovered over the mouse. He'd never known Danny felt this way. His son had never told him. Mrs. Okonkwo put her arm around Danny's shoulders. She didn't give him easy answers or false promises. She just said, "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they love. It's not your fault, Danny. Not even a little bit. Your mom has her own struggles that have nothing to do with how wonderful you are." "But Dad's never around either," Danny whispered. "He's always working. Maybe I'm just not worth being around." Robert felt like he'd been stabbed. He paused the video, his hand shaking. Mrs. Okonkwo's voice came through the speakers, firm and loving. "Now you listen to me. Your father loves you very much. He's just forgotten how to show it. Some people, when they get hurt, they bury themselves in work because it's easier than feeling the pain. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't mean he doesn't love you. You are worth everything, Danny, everything." Robert closed his laptop. He couldn't watch anymore. He'd seen enough to understand the depth of his failure as a father. Mrs. Okonkwo hadn't just been teaching Danny math and reading. She'd been holding his son together while Robert was too busy to notice his kid was falling apart. The next morning, Robert did something he almost never did. He called his assistant and cleared his entire schedule. No meetings, no calls, nothing. Then he went downstairs and found Mrs. Okonkwo preparing breakfast. "We need to talk," he said. "Please, sit down." Mrs. Okonkwo looked worried, but she sat at the kitchen table. Robert sat across from her, something he'd never done before, the housekeeper and the boss sitting like equals. It felt strange and somehow right at the same time. "I watched the security footage last night," Robert began. "I saw everything, the teaching, the conversations, the way you've been there for Danny when I wasn't." Mrs. Okonkwo's expression became guarded. "Mr. Chen, I never meant to overstep. I know my place. I'm just the housekeeper." "No," Robert said firmly. "That's where you're wrong. You're not just anything. I looked you up last night, too. Found your old resume online. University of Lagos, top of your class, 20 years teaching experience, awards for educational innovation. You were somebody important back home." She smiled sadly. "That was a different life, a different country. Here, I'm nobody. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Mrs. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. "Would it have mattered? I've applied to hundreds of teaching positions here. The moment they see my foreign degree or ask about certification, the conversation ends. I'm 54 years old. I have an accent. I clean houses. That's what America decided I'm worth." The bitterness in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Robert felt ashamed, thinking about all the assumptions he'd made, all the things he'd never bothered to ask. "What would you need?" he asked slowly. To become a certified teacher here? To teach Danny properly, officially? Mrs. Okonkwo laughed, but there was no humor in it. About $30,000 for evaluation and courses. 2 years of part-time study while somehow working 3 jobs to pay rent and send money to my family back home. And after all that, maybe someone would give me a chance. Maybe. She shook her head. I've made peace with my reality, Mr. Chen. This is my life now. What if it didn't have to be? Robert leaned forward. What if there was another way? There isn't, she said firmly. I appreciate whatever you're thinking. But I've heard promises before. People mean well, but nothing ever changes. Robert understood her skepticism. He'd probably made empty promises himself over the years, casual offers to help that he'd forgotten the moment he walked away. But this was different. This was about his son, about the woman who'd saved his son when he'd been too blind to see his kid needed saving. I want to hire you as Danny's private teacher, Robert said. Full-time. I'll cover all your certification costs. You can study during work hours. Your salary will be triple what you make now, and you'll have benefits. Real benefits. Healthcare, retirement, everything. Mrs. Okonkwo stared at him. Why would you do that? Because Danny needs you. Because you're the best teacher I've ever seen, and I've met plenty. Because my son has improved more in 3 months with you than in 2 years at his expensive private school. Robert's voice cracked slightly. Because I've been failing him and I need help fixing that. Mr. Chen. Robert, he interrupted. Please, call me Robert. She studied his face, looking for the catch. And what happens when you change your mind? When this becomes inconvenient? I'll have given up my other jobs, my independence, for what? Another disappointment? It was a fair question. Robert had built his fortune by being ruthless, by cutting losses and moving on without sentiment. But sitting there, looking at this woman who'd given his son everything while asking for nothing, he felt something shift inside him. I'm putting it in writing, he said. A contract, 3 years guaranteed minimum. If I terminated early for any reason except misconduct, you get a severance package worth 2 years' salary, and the certification costs are yours regardless, no strings attached. Mrs. Okonkwo's eyes widened. You're serious? Completely? Robert pulled out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now. We'll have papers drawn up by tomorrow. But I don't understand. Yesterday you didn't even know I could teach. Yesterday I was an idiot, Robert said bluntly. Yesterday I was so focused on building my company that I forgot to build a relationship with my own son. You showed me what I was missing, what Danny was missing. I can't give him back the time I've lost, but I can make sure going forward he has what he needs, and what he needs is you. Mrs. Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment. Robert could see the conflict on her face, the hope warring with experience, the desire to believe fighting against a lifetime of broken promises. Finally, she spoke. My husband used to say that God puts opportunities in strange packages. He died 5 years ago in a construction accident. He was an engineer back home, but here they had him doing manual labor. He never complained. He just said we had to have faith that things would work out. Her eyes glistened. I stopped believing that after he died. Maybe it's time to believe again, Robert said softly. She looked at him for another long moment, then slowly nodded. Okay. Yes, I'll do it. Robert felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by fear. He was trusting this woman with his son's education, his future. But then again, he realized he'd already been trusting her. He just hadn't known it. Danny appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas. Dad, why aren't you at work? Robert smiled at his son, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in months. Because I'm exactly where I need to be, buddy. Mrs. Okonkwo and I were just making plans. How would you feel about her becoming your full-time teacher? The hope that bloomed on Danny's face was answer enough. Everything was about to change. Robert just didn't realize yet how much. 6 months later, the Chen household looked completely different. Not the furniture or the walls, but the feeling inside those walls. Life had changed in ways Robert never expected. Mrs. Okonkwo no longer wore the plain uniform she'd arrived in every morning. Now she dressed like the professional she was, comfortable blouses and slacks, her certification papers framed and hanging in what used to be the formal sitting room. That room had been transformed into a proper classroom, with bookshelves, a whiteboard, comfortable seating, and all the learning materials Danny could need. But the biggest change wasn't in the house. It was in Robert himself. For the first time in nearly a decade, he'd restructured his entire work schedule. He delegated more to his management team. He started leaving the office at 4:30 instead of 8 at night. And every evening at 6, he sat down for dinner with Danny and Mrs. Okonkwo. Those dinners became Robert's favorite part of the day. Danny would talk nonstop about what he'd learned, his eyes bright. Tea with excitement. Last week it was the Roman Empire. This week it was marine biology. Danny didn't just memorize facts anymore. He understood things, questioned things, connected ideas in ways that sometimes surprised even Robert. "Did you know?" Danny said one evening, twirling spaghetti on his fork, "that octopuses have 3 hearts and blue blood, and they're so smart they can solve puzzles and use tools. Mrs. Okonkwo says intelligence comes in different forms. Some people are good with numbers, some with words, some with their hands. Octopuses are good at adapting." Robert glanced at Mrs. Okonkwo, who smiled quietly. She'd taught Danny more than facts. She'd taught him that being different wasn't wrong, that his brain, which worked in pictures and stories instead of straight memorization, was actually a strength. "Speaking of adapting," Robert said, "I have some news. I've been working on something with my foundation, and I wanted to tell you both about it." Mrs. Okonkwo looked up, curious. Over the past months, she and Robert had developed an easy working relationship. She'd stopped being nervous around him, and he'd stopped treating her like an employee. They'd become something closer to partners in Danny's education. "I want to start a school," Robert continued, "a place for kids who learn differently, like Danny. And I want to staff it with teachers like you, people with incredible qualifications from other countries who can't get certified here easily. We'd help them get certified while they teach, create a bridge between their expertise and the American system." Danny's eyes went wide. "That's so cool, Dad. Can I go there?" "That's the idea," Robert said. "But there's a lot of work to do first. Finding a building, hiring staff, getting licenses and approvals. It could take a year or more." Mrs. Okonkwo was quiet, her expression thoughtful. "You're serious about this? A whole school?" "Completely serious. I've already hired consultants. But I need your help designing it. The curriculum, the teaching approach, everything. You know what works. I just have the money to make it happen." She shook her head slowly, a small smile on her face. "6 months ago, I was cleaning toilets and hiding my degree because it made people uncomfortable. Now you want me to design a school?" "Not just any school," Robert corrected. "The school I wish had existed when Danny was struggling. The school that values teachers for their knowledge, not just their paperwork." It sounded perfect, almost too perfect. And that's when the first real problem emerged. A week later, Robert was called into a meeting at Danny's private school. The headmaster, Mr. Patterson, sat behind his massive desk looking stern. Danny's homeroom teacher was there too, her expression disapproving. "Mr. Chen," the headmaster began, "we've noticed Danny's remarkable improvement this year. His test scores have skyrocketed. His participation in class is excellent. We're very proud of the progress our institution has facilitated." Robert felt his jaw tighten. Their institution hadn't done anything. They'd been failing Danny for 2 years. But he stayed quiet, waiting. "However," Mr. Patterson continued, "we've heard rumors that you're considering withdrawing Danny to be homeschooled. We strongly advise against this. Our academy provides socialization, structure, and resources that homeschooling simply cannot match. Danny will still have socialization," Robert said carefully, "and structure. Just a different kind." The teacher leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, is it true that your housekeeper would be doing the teaching?" There it was, the real issue. Robert felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Mrs. Okonkwo has a master's degree in education and 20 years of teaching experience. She's in the process of getting her American certification. She's more qualified than most teachers here." Mr. Patterson's expression showed what he thought of that claim. A foreign degree is very different from an American education. And without full certification, well, I'm sure she's a lovely woman, but Danny deserves better than being someone's practice project. Practice project? Robert's voice went cold. She's done more for my son in 6 months than this school did in 2 years. Danny was failing here, crying himself to sleep, calling himself stupid. Now he loves learning. That's not practice. That's expertise. Mr. Chen, I understand you're grateful for the help you've received, the headmaster said in a condescending tone. But emotion shouldn't override common sense. Danny belongs in a proper institution with certified professionals. Surely you can see that removing him from our academy to be taught by your domestic staff would be, well, irregular. Robert stood up. This meeting is over. Mr. Chen, please reconsider. No. Robert's voice was firm. You had Danny for 2 years and made him feel worthless. Mrs. Okonkwo had him for 6 months and gave him back his confidence. The choice is pretty clear to me. He walked out, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard the teacher whisper to the headmaster, I knew this would happen. These rich people get one idea in their heads and think they know better than educators. Robert wanted to turn around and tell them exactly what he thought of their education methods. But he didn't. He just left. That evening, he told Mrs. Okonkwo about the meeting. They were in the classroom after Danny had gone to bed. She was organizing materials for the next day's lessons. They called you my domestic staff, Robert said, still angry. Like teaching Danny was somehow beneath you because you also happened to clean houses. Mrs. Okonkwo set down the books she was holding. Robert, I've been called worse things. People have made assumptions about me my entire life here. Because of my accent, my skin color, where I'm from. I'm used to it. Well, you shouldn't have to be, Robert said. It's not right. No, it's not. But getting angry won't change it. The only thing that changes people's minds is proof. Show them what Danny can do. Show them what I can teach. Build that school you're talking about and fill it with successful students. That's how you win. Robert looked at her. This woman who'd faced more obstacles in her life than he could imagine, and yet somehow maintained her dignity and grace. How do you stay so calm about it? Because I know my worth, she said simply. I don't need Mr. Patterson or anyone else to validate what I know I can do. I've taught hundreds of students. I've changed lives. Their opinion doesn't change that truth. Her words struck Robert deeply. He'd spent his whole life seeking validation through success, through wealth, through status. But Mrs. Okonkwo had something he was still learning, an unshakable sense of self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval. Teach me, he said suddenly. She looked confused. Teach you what? How to teach Danny. I want to be part of his education, not just paying for it. I want to actually know my son, understand how he thinks, what he needs. I've been learning by watching you, but I want to do more. Mrs. Okonkwo studied him for a moment, then smiled. Okay, tomorrow you'll co-teach with me. Danny will love it. And Danny did love it. The next afternoon, Robert sat in the classroom, helping his son build a model of the solar system while Mrs. Okonkwo explained planetary orbits. Robert's hands got covered in paint and glue. He made mistakes, put Mars in the wrong position, forgot which planet had rings besides Saturn. Danny giggled and corrected him. Dad, that's Jupiter. Saturn is the one with the big rings. Right, Robert laughed. Sorry, buddy. I'm still learning. That's okay, Danny said seriously. Mrs. Okonkwo says everyone's always learning. Even adults. Even you. Robert looked at his son, really looked at him, and felt his chest tighten with emotion. His boy was teaching him, not just about planets, but about patience, about presence, about what really mattered. That night, after Danny was asleep, Robert found himself thinking about the headmaster's words. Irregular. They'd called his choice irregular. Maybe it was. But regular hadn't been working. Regular had left his son struggling and miserable. Sometimes irregular was exactly what you needed. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. About that school project, he said. Let's accelerate the timeline. I want to be open by next fall. On the other end, his lawyer sighed. Robert, that's ambitious. The permits alone make it happen, Robert said. Whatever it takes. There are kids out there like Danny who need this, and teachers like Mrs. Okonkwo who deserve a chance. After he hung up, Robert sat in his office looking at a picture on his desk. It was from last week. Danny had taken it without him knowing. Robert and Mrs. Okonkwo were both bent over Danny's work, pointing at something, all three of them smiling. They looked like a team. More than that, they looked like a family. The thought didn't scare Robert as much as it probably should have. The school opened its doors exactly 11 months after that first conversation at the kitchen table. Robert had pulled every string he had, called in favors and thrown money at problems until they disappeared. The result was a beautiful 3-story building that used to be an old community center, now renovated into bright classrooms with windows that let in natural light. They called it the Bridge Academy. Mrs. Okonkwo had chosen the name. A bridge between different ways of learning, different cultures, different possibilities. Opening day was chaos in the best possible way. 25 students showed up, ranging from 6 to 12 years old. All of them had struggled in traditional schools. All of them had parents who were desperate and hopeful and slightly skeptical that this experimental place could really be different. Robert stood in the hallway watching Mrs. Okonkwo greet each family. She wore a professional dress and her certification badge, now fully official. She'd passed every exam, completed every requirement. She was Dr. Okonkwo now, though she still insisted Robert call her by her first name, Grace. It had taken him months to feel comfortable with that. Grace moved from family to family with ease, switching between English and Spanish, even speaking some Mandarin to one mother, who looked overwhelmed. She had a gift for making people feel seen, valued, heard. Robert had watched her do it with Danny for a year now, and it still amazed him every time. Danny was there too, helping a nervous 6-year-old find her classroom. At 10 years old now, Danny had grown more confident, more outgoing. He'd become the unofficial welcome committee, telling other kids about how much they were going to love learning here. "It's nothing like regular school," Danny told a boy who looked terrified. "Nobody makes you feel dumb here. And the teachers actually listen when you talk." Robert felt pride swell in his chest. This was his son. Confident, kind, articulate. So different from the crying child he'd seen on that security footage 18 months ago. The first month was rough. There were problems with the building's plumbing. One teacher quit after 2 weeks, saying the students were too difficult. Several parents complained that their kids weren't getting enough traditional homework. Robert spent most of his time putting out fires and questioning whether he'd made a huge mistake. But then something shifted. The students started showing progress. Real progress. A 9-year-old who'd been labeled as having severe learning disabilities was suddenly reading at grade level. A 12-year-old who'd been expelled from 3 schools for behavior problems became the top student in his math class. The local newspaper ran a story. Then a TV station asked to do a segment. Suddenly everyone wanted to know about the billionaire who'd started a school for struggling kids, staffed mostly by immigrant teachers with foreign degrees. Robert did one interview and hated every minute of it. The reporter seemed more interested in making him look like a hero than in talking about the teachers and students doing the actual work. After that, he refused all media requests and told them to talk to Grace instead. Grace handled the attention with her usual grace. She talked about teaching methods and brain development, and the importance of meeting students where they were. She never mentioned that she'd been cleaning houses just 2 years ago. She carried herself like she'd always been exactly where she belonged. One evening, after a particularly long day at the school, Robert and Grace sat in his home office going over enrollment applications for the next school year. Danny was upstairs doing homework, probably finished already but drawing pictures of whatever he was thinking about lately. Space stations, most likely. The kid was obsessed with astronomy these days. "We have 53 applications," Grace said, looking at her tablet. "We only have room for 15 more students. We could expand," Robert suggested. "Rent another floor, hire more teachers, and that costs money. Even with your foundation, we need to be sustainable." "Grace, money isn't the issue." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Money is always an issue, Robert. You can't just throw cash at everything forever. The school needs to work on its own eventually, without you constantly pouring in funds." He knew she was right. She usually was. Over the past year, Grace had become more than Danny's teacher. She'd become his advisor, his conscience, his reality check. Somewhere along the way, she'd also become his friend. "There's something else," Grace said, setting down the tablet. "I've been thinking about this for a while. The school is doing well, Danny is thriving, and I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I think it's time for me to find my own place to live." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What? Why?" "Because it's not appropriate anymore. When I was the housekeeper, living in the staff quarters made sense. But now I'm the director of a school. I'm a professional, and people are starting to talk. Let them talk, Robert said, more harshly than he intended. Who cares what people say? I care, Grace said firmly. Your ex-wife's lawyer has been asking questions. There are rumors that I manipulated you, that I seduced my wealthy employer to get ahead. It's ugly, Robert, and it could hurt the school's reputation. Robert stood up, agitated. That's ridiculous. You've never done anything inappropriate. You've been nothing but professional. I know that. You know that. But perception matters, especially for a school that's already unconventional. We can't give people ammunition to use against us. So what, you just leave? After everything? Robert heard his voice rising and tried to calm down. Danny needs you here. Danny will still see me every day at school. This isn't about him. Grace stood too, facing him. This is about protecting what we've built, and about me maintaining my independence. They stood there in tense silence. Robert knew she was making sense, but he hated it. The thought of Grace not being in the house, not being there for dinner every night, not being just down the hall, made him feel something he didn't want to examine too closely. Can I ask you something? Grace said quietly. And I want an honest answer. Robert nodded. Why does the idea of me leaving bother you so much? Is it really about Danny, or is it about something else? The question hung in the air between them. Robert could deflect, could make it about logistics or Danny's needs or a dozen other things. But Grace had always been honest with him. She deserved the same. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's more than both. All I know is that this house feels empty when you're not here. That I look forward to dinner not because of the food, but because you'll be there. That I find myself wanting to tell you about my day, to hear your opinion on things that have nothing to do with Danny or the school. Grace's expression softened. Robert, I'm not asking you for anything, he continued quickly. I'm not trying to make this weird or put pressure on you. I just needed to be honest. You changed my life, Grace. You gave me back my son. You showed me what actually matters. And somewhere in all of that, you became important to me in ways that have nothing to do with teaching or the school. She was quiet for a long moment. This is exactly why I need to move out. Because I've been feeling the same things and it scares me. You're my employer, Robert. You hold all the power in this situation. If things go wrong, I lose everything. My job, my home, my professional reputation. Things won't go wrong. You can't promise that. Nobody can. Grace crossed her arms, looking vulnerable in a way he rarely saw. I came to this country with my husband 15 years ago. We had such big dreams. When he died, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd just survive until I didn't anymore. Then you gave me a chance to teach again, to use my mind instead of just my hands. I can't risk losing that. Robert understood her fear. He'd spent his whole career calculating risks and rewards. But this wasn't business. This was messier, more complicated, more real. So what do? He asked. I move out. I get my own apartment. We maintain professional boundaries. And we see what happens naturally, without the complication of living under the same roof. She smiled slightly. If there's something real here, it'll survive that separation. If it's just proximity and gratitude, we'll figure that out too. It made sense. It was the smart thing to do. Robert hated it anyway. Okay, he said finally, but I'm helping you find a place. A good place in a safe neighborhood. I can find my own apartment, Robert. I know you can, but let me help anyway, please. Grace studied his face, then nodded. Okay, but I'm paying my own rent. Stubborn woman, Robert muttered. Stubborn man, she replied. But she was smiling. 3 weeks later, Grace moved into a small but nice apartment, 15 minutes from the school. Danny helped her pack, trying not to cry. Robert loaded boxes into his car, trying not to show how much he hated this. That night, dinner was just Robert and Danny. The table felt too big, too empty. Danny pushed his food around his plate. It's weird without her here, Danny said quietly. Yeah, Robert agreed. It really is. But maybe weird was what they needed. Maybe distance would give clarity. Robert could only hope that what he felt was real enough to survive it. 8 months passed. 8 months of Grace living in her own apartment, maintaining professional boundaries, being Danny's teacher and the school's director, but nothing more. 8 months of polite conversations and careful distance. 8 months of Robert lying awake at night wondering if he'd lost something important by respecting that distance. The Bridge Academy was thriving. They'd expanded to 45 students and had a waiting list of over 100. 3 more teachers had been hired. all immigrants with impressive credentials from their home countries. The local school district had even started sending administrators to observe their methods. Danny was 12 now, confident and happy. He'd started a tutoring program where older students helped younger ones, turning his own experience into something that could help others. Robert had never been more proud of his son, but something was missing. Robert felt it every day when he came home to the empty house. Grace had been right about needing space, but that didn't make it any easier. One Saturday afternoon in April, Robert was in the school library helping organize books for the upcoming book fair when Grace walked in. She looked tired but happy, carrying a stack of student artwork. "These are for the display," she said, setting them on the table. "The kids have been working on self-portraits with written reflections about their growth. Some of them are really powerful." Robert picked up one from the top. It was Danny's work. The portrait showed him standing confidently, and the reflection read, "I used to think I was broken because I learned differently. Now I know I was just learning in a way schools weren't ready for. Dr. Okonkwo taught me that different isn't wrong. My dad learned that lesson too. Now we're both better." Robert felt his throat tighten. He showed it to Grace, she read it, and her eyes got misty. "That boy has wisdom beyond his years." "He learned it from you," Robert said quietly. They stood there in comfortable silence, something that had become rare over the past months. Finally, Grace spoke. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Do you remember when you first offered me this job? You asked what I would need to become a certified teacher again. I remember. You gave me everything I needed, the money, the time, the opportunity. But there was something I didn't mention because I didn't think it was possible." She paused, looking at the student artwork. "A partner. Someone who believed in the same things I did. Someone who saw education as more than just test scores and college admissions. Someone who understood that teaching is about seeing potential in every child and giving them the tools to reach it." Robert's heart started beating faster. "Grace, let me finish," she said gently. "These past 8 months have been good for me. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand on my own, that everything I'd accomplished wasn't just because of your money or your connections. I needed to know that I was truly capable, truly valuable. You've always been valuable, I know that now. Really know it deep down. The school is succeeding not because you funded it, but because we built it together. You brought resources and vision. I brought experience and methodology. But more than that, we brought respect for each other's strengths." Robert set down the portrait carefully. "What are you saying?" Grace took a breath. "I'm saying that I've spent 8 months being professional and careful and appropriate. And I'm tired of it. I'm 56 years old, Robert. I've been alone for 7 years. I've told myself that was enough, that my work was enough. But it's not. Grace, I don't want you to feel pressured. I'm not pressured. I'm sure." She smiled at him, really smiled in a way she hadn't in months. "I love what we've built together. The school, yes, but also the life we created for Danny. The dinners, the conversations, the way we challenge each other. I miss that. I miss you." Robert felt like he could barely breathe. "I've missed you too. Every single day." "I know moving out was the right thing to do," Grace continued. "We needed that time to figure out what was real and what wasn't. And now I know. This is real, Robert. What we have, what we've built, what we could be together. That's real." Robert moved closer to her. "I'm not good at this. At relationships, at expressing feelings. My ex-wife could tell you that. I'm better with spreadsheets and business plans." "I don't need spreadsheets," Grace said softly. "I just need honesty. Can you give me that?" "Yes." Robert took her hands in his. "Here's the honest truth. You walked into my life as my housekeeper, and you ended up teaching me everything that matters. You taught Danny how to learn. You taught me how to be present. You showed me that real wealth isn't money or success or any of the things I spent 20 years chasing. It's this connection, purpose, love." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "That's more than I expected from a man who's better with spreadsheets." They both laughed, and then somehow they were hugging, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. Robert held her carefully like she was precious because she was. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we take it slow," Grace said, pulling back to look at him. "We date like normal people. We see where this goes. And we're honest with Danny about it because he deserves to know what's happening." "He's going to be insufferable," Robert said. "He's been dropping hints for months that we should get back together. As if we were ever actually together before. That child is too perceptive for his own good." They told Danny that evening over dinner at Robert's house. Grace had been invited for the first time in months, and Danny had noticed immediately that something was different. So, Robert began awkwardly, "Grace and I wanted to talk to you about something." Danny looked up from his pasta, eyes bright with interest. Finally what?" Grace asked. "Finally you're telling me you like each other. Dad, I'm 12, not stupid. You've been miserable for 8 months. And Dr. Okonkwo, you kept finding excuses to stop by the house. It was pretty obvious." Robert and Grace exchanged glances. "Were we really that transparent?" Robert asked. "Completely," Danny said cheerfully. "So are you dating now? Are you getting married? Is Dr. Okonkwo moving back in?" "Slow down," Grace laughed. "We're taking things slowly." "Yes, we're dating. No, we're not getting married right away. And no, I'm keeping my apartment for now. But eventually," Danny pressed. "Eventually, maybe," Robert said. "How do you feel about that? About Grace and me being together?" Danny was quiet for a moment, his face serious. "Dr. Okonkwo makes you happy, Dad, like really happy. Not fake happy where you're smiling but your eyes are sad. Real happy. And you make her laugh, which is cool because she's usually so serious at school." He looked at Grace. "And you've been here for me when nobody else was. You never treated me like I was broken or difficult. You just saw me." Grace reached over and squeezed his hand. "You were never broken, sweetheart. Not for 1 second. I know that now," Danny said. "Because you taught me. Both of you taught me a lot, actually. You taught me that family isn't just about biology. It's about who shows up, who stays, who sees you and loves you anyway." Robert felt tears prickling his eyes. When had his son become so wise? "So yeah," Danny continued, "I'm cool with you dating. Actually, I think it's great. Just please don't be weird and gross about it." They all laughed, and the tension broke. That night, after Grace had gone home and Danny was in bed, Robert stood in his office looking at the photo on his desk. The one Danny had taken 2 years ago, of the 3 of them bent over a school project, smiling. He picked up his phone and called Grace. "Hey," she answered, her voice warm. "Miss me already?" "Every second you're not here," he admitted. "Is that too much?" "No," she said softly. "It's exactly right." They talked for an hour about nothing and everything. The school Danny, their plans for the summer, a book Grace was reading. Simple, ordinary things that felt extraordinary because they were sharing them. When they finally said goodnight, Robert realized something. He'd spent his whole life building an empire, accumulating wealth, chasing success. But the best thing he'd ever done was come home early on a random Thursday and actually pay attention to what was happening in his own house. He'd walked in expecting nothing and found everything. A teacher who became a partner. A son who became confident. A life that became meaningful. 3 years later, Robert and Grace got married in the school library, surrounded by students, teachers, and families whose lives had been changed by the Bridge Academy. Danny was the best man, giving a speech that made everyone laugh and cry. The school had grown to 3 locations. Grace had published a book on inclusive teaching methods that was being used in education programs nationwide. Robert had stepped back from his company almost entirely, focusing on educational reform and spending time with the people he loved. But the best part wasn't the success or the recognition or even the impact they'd made. The best part was coming home every evening to Grace and Danny, sitting down to dinner and talking about their days. The best part was the ordinary moments that had once seemed so insignificant but had turned out to be everything. Robert had learned what real wealth looked like. It looked like love, presence, and partnership. It looked like a woman who'd refused to let circumstances define her worth. It looked like a son who'd taught him to see what really mattered. It looked like family, the one you're born with and the one you build. And for the first time in his life, Robert Chen was truly, completely rich.